Hi friends, thanks for tuning into Sunday School Bonanza, a This Week in Mormons production. We're happy to bring you a gospel doctrine rundown and get you ready for church or replace your experience if you were stuck in primary, as I often am as well.
Or stuck in traffic if you're really late.
Is that a good thing to do? Do you listen to it in traffic?
Yeah, I do. I do, actually.
Look
or
at
at work. You know, all the places. All the places.
I can't do things like this at work because then I can't focus on, the spreadsheets I'm looking at. Numbers and stuff.
You should focus on what's really important.
Sorry, we have a new host this week, everybody. So that voice isn't just some new one that you don't recognize. This isn't like the last lesson with Samuel hearing the Lord's voice and does not know what it is. We don't want that to happen to you, so we're going to tell you. Let's quit laughing, wife. So we're joined, everyone, by Sam Dodini. Sam, hi.
Hi.
For people who don't know you, why don't you just give us an elevator pitch? Tell us about you. So
elevator pitch. I am a youngin', 25 years old. Married a cougar wife who's 37 days older than I am.
That a boy.
Just celebrated our first anniversary.
Yay.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yep.
Good job.
I work in the D.C. as an economic consultant at the moment.
Well, that sounds fancy.
It involves spreadsheets.
Sam knows lots of things about economics, actually. His Facebook page, he just posts things with the word macro and micro all the time, and I nod and pretend like I know what's going on.
Vocabulary.
That's about it. Speaking of vocabulary, this lesson, by the way, we're going to have a great attention activity built around vocabulary. Our lesson this week is lesson 22. It's called The Lord Looketh on the Heart. Your reading will be a lot of the back end of 1 Samuel, chapters 9, 10, 13, 15, 16, 17. A lot of action happens in these chapters, though. This is not a slow-going lesson per se. A lot of stuff goes down. And so speaking of that attention activity, your teacher might write a random word upon the board, such as diaspora, I never know if I say it correctly, or other words like hyssop or laver. And then the point of this is, for a wonderful attention activity, that you might not understand the word because understanding the definition of an unfamiliar word is like making decisions based on only your understanding. So as we turn to like a trusted source, we learn better. I believe the parallel here is that Samuel the prophet knows better. That's what I'm getting from this.
That's what I'm getting as well.
So, diving right in, we're getting to our good friend Saul. Saul's he's a pretty good fella at this point in time. Okay, so Saul, we're in chapter 9. And now, if you remember from the last lesson, the Israelites wanted a king. Okay, there had been a reign of judges for a long time, and they were really pressuring to do away with that. The prophets at the time, even Samuel, was like, But as is often the case, as we see a lot in the Old Testament, eventually the Lord relents a lot in one way or another, and says, "Okay, you want your king? You're going to have your king." But the Lord sort of chooses the king. He doesn't just leave them to their own devices. And so the Lord told Samuel to anoint Saul as Israel's first king. And Saul was a great guy right here. He did all these wonderful things. I believe there's a story he was diligent in finding his father's donkeys. He listened to wise counsel. He trusted Samuel very much. He was very, very humble. And he prophesied. He was just an all-around good guy. And everything you would expect, hopefully, in a new king to lead Israel, which, if we remember, for all this time has been a theocracy in one way or another. But remember, of course, Saul himself is not the prophet. Samuel is. But, of course, he's seeking to lead them in righteousness. But unfortunately, like in many, many cases in the scriptures, like with David, who we'll talk about later, Solomon, every now and then power gets to people's head, and people start to forget the Lord. And we saw this even before that as well. So it gets things unravel a little bit, I guess, as we go.
They do. It looks like it starts off a little bit after Saul has had the success in battle and he's merciful to the people that have been destroyed. There's a point in time in which Saul takes it upon himself to offer a burnt offering to the Lord without Samuel's approval.
Okay.
Without that authority. And when Samuel approaches him about it, he says, "Well, I forced it. I needed to do it. You weren't here." So I think we have kind of one of those steadying the ark type of situations.
One of my favorite expressions. I knew we brought you here for the right reasons. This is wonderful.
Well, it's interesting that the Lord seems to take that very seriously, not just in the Old Testament, but all throughout the history of the Bible, as well as in modern Scripture, about the fact that authority is important. Having that order to things is extremely important. And he doesn't mess around when it comes to that.
No. No, not at all. I mean, and the amazing thing is, just like studying the ark with Uzzah, I mean, there are good intentions involved oftentimes. I don't think this was at a stage when Saul was sort of, backing away in cowardice or trying to cast blame. I believe Saul was genuinely feeling like, great, we need to offer this sacrifice. No one else is around, but we know what to do, so let's do it. But he lacked authority, keys, whatever you need to do those things. And of course, he was chastised accordingly. I like what Elder Talmage wrote about this, actually, in Articles of Faith. He said, Saul prepared the burnt offering himself, forgetting that though he occupied the throne, wore the crown, and bore the scepter, he had no right to officiate in the priesthood of God. And for this and other instances of his unrighteous presumption, he was rejected of God, and another was made a king in his place. Yeah, and that king would be David, of course. Should we travel on to do more of Saul's descent into
let's do that
into ignominy? Okay, 1 Samuel 15. I love 1 Samuel 15. People say, "What? You love 1 Samuel 15? What's there?" It's a great story about the importance of obedience to the Lord. And I think even the part before that of even Saul offering sacrifices was the start of that. But in this chapter, Saul has been commanded to lead Israel in utterly destroying the Amalekites, who have long been their neighbors, just like a lot of the other people on the periphery of Israel that often negatively affect Israel. There have been previous gospel doctrine lessons you might remember. We talk about sort of the rough effects of various neighbors or of allowing little bits of iniquity into your life. And so, but what happened, well, maybe do you know what happened here, Sam? Like, what happened in this story?
So the Lord commands Saul, as they're fighting the Amalekites, to destroy the entire civilization, pretty much. Men, women, children, all the flocks, basically to get rid of all the iniquity that surrounds Israel so that they won't be infiltrated by that. Clean slate, absolutely. And Saul doesn't do that. He and the people make this decision to keep some of the good things from the conquered Amalekites. Again, possibly with those good intentions of saying, okay, we've gotten these good spoils of war. Let's either share them with the people that that we're leading, or even offer them to the Lord.
Yeah.
But despite those good intentions, it wasn't what the Lord had intended with the first commandment.
And I love the way it starts, because Saul actually takes Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and takes him with him. And that also was not part of the initial plan. He says, like, no, what we're going to do is we're going to take the king and take him ransom and have him as our prisoner. That's valuable. It sends a message, right? And this is when the voice of the Lord comes to Samuel, and he says, his actual words are, "It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me and hath not formed my commandments." And as you said later on, then we find out he kept parts of their flocks for sacrifices, whether there was, good intentions or not. That wasn't what he was commanded to do. And then he starts casting blame on the people, like, well, this is their fault. They wanted this, and I'm just going along. I'm just their king. I'm not their boss. I'm just trying to lead the people. And it's very sad as we slowly wind down. And one of my favorite scriptures pops up here near the end, where it says in 22, "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice." That's what Samuel tells Saul, and Samuel's very disappointed in Saul. And I love those few words there, because, of course, sacrificing under Mosaic law was a huge deal. This was not necessarily sacrifice in the same sense as we think of it, but it was this huge part of what they did as Israelites. And he was saying, no, what's the most important thing is for you to obey. And even if I tell you do not sacrifice, even if that is going against everything you know about regarding the tabernacle, you don't do it, because obedience is far more important. And from that point on, that's when he says, all right, no more Saul. I'm going to raise up somebody else to run the show.
Well, I think that kind of pinpoints the importance of Christ's words when he talks about offer a new sacrifice, a broken heart and a contrite spirit. And that's basically changing your heart, changing your desires to be more in line with what the Lord wants. And that level of obedience is exactly what the Lord is asking of us. Rather than doing all these works of the law, he's asking for more. Because it starts from a more basic level. It starts in your heart before you start to act. And I think that's one of the things that Saul kind of trips up on is where were his intentions with this? Maybe they were good intentions, but they were not kind of in line with what the Lord wanted. And the more I read into the Old Testament, a lot of what I see is the Lord is trying to chasten the people, to have them change their attitudes, to change their perceptions, to be more in line with what he's looking for. And so I think that's an object lesson to us too. Part of our reason that we're here on the earth is to change our perceptions of who we are, to be more in line with this eternal perspective that the Lord's trying to help us to see.
That's a really interesting point, because I think it's so easy to focus on trying to change who we are, our actions and the things we do. And I think all too often we don't necessarily focus on just changing our attitude and trying to change, what's really deep down and what comes from within. That's a great observation. I think that's something so key. And I think for the Israelites especially, which is so much more rooted in this fierce sort of dogma and the exact rites and rituals they have to undertake under Mosaic law, to think like, hey, it doesn't matter if you go through the motions, which I have very clearly laid out for you to do. You have to have a change of heart. And speaking of hearts, of course, hey, that was a good one. We go to 1 Samuel 16, great chapter here. One of those classic verses shows up because we talk about, what Samuel learned while trying to determine which of Jesse's sons should be the king. And there were many great candidates, all these great people. But as it said here in verse 7, for the Lord seeth not as men seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. And it's my understanding that David was not particularly formidable looking. I mean, he seemed to be just a feeble, kind of the unassuming brother amongst all these, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I kind of assume he looks like Donny Osmond in Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Beautiful.
Just even if he's just kind of a beautiful man, he's just not as tough looking.
That's David Archuleta for all you modern listeners, okay? He looks like David Archuleta.
Yep.
When you picture King David, that's who I want you to picture. But when he's older, he looks like Jordan Knight from New Kids on the Block. Just came up with that right now. So he chooses, this part's pretty straightforward, but of course, he chooses David and says David's going to be the king. He's going to raise him up. I think there's plenty of people who would doubt that at that time. They're like, really, this guy? For me, that's a great lesson, because there have been people, I think it's so easy. You see people called into leadership positions where you would never expect it to happen. Not that you have anything against an individual, but you just say, wait a minute, her, him, really? That's the way we're going to go. Not the choice I would have logically thought of, but go figure. There we have it. And David definitely proves himself too as we go on. So our last little section here, David and Goliath. Sam, what can you tell us about David and Goliath that we don't already know? Let's assume everyone listening knows the story.
Well, let's take this a little bit further here. So this is in the middle of the war with the Philistines, and Saul is there, and along with the people of Israel, and they are terrified of this giant person, 6 cubits tall, Goliath.
How tall is 6 cubits? I forget.
It's a cubit, like a foot and a half.
It's pretty big. I think he was over 8 feet tall. I did it once in seminary or something like that. But yeah,
which is, that's a huge human person.
Big fella. Yeah.
Yeah. So David is the son of Jesse. And David has all these older brothers who have gone to the battle to see this feat, and David follows them. And the interesting thing that David is rebuked for actually being there, and yet he felt compelled to be there, as if the Lord had something in store for him. And I think that the preparation into going into battle, the preparation for the experiences the Lord wants to give us, I think is part of what David had undergone. He'd been preparing from a very young age to where he had the faith necessary to say, let me go with my sling to fight Goliath. And I think it's interesting that even after, during, actually right before the battle, David and Goliath have this exchange where Goliath basically looks at him and laughs.
Yeah.
And David goes through this huge speech, and it's actually really gory looking. And he says, I will smite your head off.
Yeah.
And the end goal of all that is so that the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. I find it fascinating that in kind of the culture of war, people are always looking at dominance and to exert power and authority, and it's always for glory and things like that. And yet David's whole perspective is, I want this to be a testimony of the God who's in Israel, of our relationship, and the fact that he backs us up. And the humility to say that, I think, is incredible. And that's part of why the Lord gave him that success.
Yeah, and it's a huge thing. I mean, let it be known that Israel will not be trifled with in this sense. Because, of course, there was a time when many people, they feared the army of Israel, absolutely. I mean, how would you feel? You've got these people who wandered for 40 years, so they're not settled or in any way have any kind of industry. And then they cross the Jordan and wipe out the Canaanites for the most part. And and they settle in this certain land, but their neighbors still, refuse to get along with them, and we're always bitter about them, which we see interesting parallels of today at the same time with the modern state of Israel. But I like what you said there, that David was not doing it for his own glory or even for the glory of his nation, but he was doing it for the glory of the Lord's nation in that sense. It wasn't political. It was very much a religious statement by slaying Goliath. And of course, we learn a great lesson as well, that when the Lord is with you, all things are possible. You have the obvious contender, a 9-foot-tall giant who can just pulverize anybody. And you have David, little guy, got a sling, but he's more strategic, and he has the Lord on his side and is able to lay waste to this giant. And imagine the fear that would strike into anybody. If you saw anything similar to that today, I don't know when or where that would happen unless you did like UFC championship with the wrong classes of people. I don't know. But that's powerful. I mean, it's really amazing. And of course there are Goliaths all around us today. And I think there are obvious parallels that any of us can think about here, where there are what seems like a daunting challenge against improbable odds that we cannot overcome. But we should always remember that we can overcome those things. We can overcome anything if we actually have enough faith in the Lord, and if we're doing things not for our own glory, but if we're doing so that we can glorify the Lord and do good on his name, I guess you could say.
Well, in addition to that, I think David was inspired with the weapon that he chose, and it wasn't just the Lord handing him Goliath, completely wounded, unlike Laban, that kind of situation with Nephi.
Right.
I think the Lord inspired David to know what weapon to use. If he used anything else, maybe a sword or something like that, hand-to-hand type of combat, then he probably would have lost. But the fact that the Lord inspired him to use the weapon that he did, I think we can draw a parallel with that as well. The Lord will give us the inspiration to know what tools we have at our disposal, what options we have about the choices we can make, and which choices will lead us down that path that will make us most successful in life and make us most successful through those trials.
Absolutely. I love that. What a great note to go out on. So in review, everybody, one of the great points here, of course, don't rationalize sin. I think that's what we take away from Saul who makes a lot of excuses to do things wrong. And what this lesson doesn't cover much of, sadly, are the subsequent chapters where Saul is kind of just like stalking David all around Israel, trying to figure out ways to get rid of him because he knows what's been prophesied of. And this goes on for a very long time, actually. And it's amazing because you see it like great foes of cinema, or basically, where like Saul and David will talk to each other, and you can see the tension right there. But don't rationalize your sin. Defeat your Goliath. Stand up tall and proud, and know that the Lord will be on your side. Look after you. That's what I say, anyway.
That's also what I say.
What do I know, though? This guy's smarter than me, and he's like, "You're a lot younger than me than I thought you were, Sam. I'm not gonna lie. When you gave away your age, I felt much older." But we're not going to reveal that. We'll save that for another episode of Sunday School Bonanza, everybody. Tune in next week to find out how old I am. So once again, please visit us at thisweekinmormons.com. Send us an email, contact@thisweekinmormons.com. Go to facebook.com/thisweekinmormons. What are we, at The Real Twim on Twitter? Sam tweets at us sometimes. And, Google+, Pinterest, if you're into like casserole recipes and stuff like that. And, subscribe.
I've had Jeff's casseroles. They're delicious.
Subscribe to these podcasts on iTunes, everybody, and spread the word. We would love that. Sam, we very much appreciate you joining us this week.
Love being here.
Everyone, send Sam your love if you like what you heard. Appreciate it. And this has been another Sunday School Bonanza, wishing you a positive gospel